So what exactly is a net lease? Well, simply put, a net lease is a type of lease agreement where the tenant is responsible for paying a portion or all of the property's operating expenses in addition to the base rent. These expenses typically include property taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs. In other words, a net lease shifts some of the financial responsibility from the landlord to the tenant. As a result, the base rent for a net lease is typically lower than that of a traditional lease, as the tenant is taking on more financial responsibility for the property. There are several different types of net leases, each of which determine which expenses are the tenant's responsibility. First is a single net lease. In a single net lease, the tenant is responsible for paying property taxes, while the landlord is responsible for insurance and maintenance costs. The second is a double net lease. In a double net lease, the tenant is responsible for both property taxes and insurance, while the landlord covers maintenance costs. And the third net lease, which is the most popular one, the triple net lease. In a triple net lease, the tenant is responsible for all three types of expenses: property taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs. So why would a landlord choose to offer a net lease instead of a traditional lease? Well, there are several benefits to a net lease, including predictable expenses. With a net lease, the tenant is responsible for paying a portion or all of the property's operating expenses. This makes it easier for the landlord to predict their expenses and budget accordingly. Second, there's a lower base rent. As we mentioned earlier, the base rent for a net lease is typically lower than that of a traditional lease, which can make the property more attractive to potential tenants. Lastly, it reduces the risk. By shifting some of the financial responsibility to the tenant, the landlord can reduce their overall risk and potentially increase their return on investment. While there are several benefits to a net lease, there are also some drawbacks to consider. This includes limited control. With a net lease, the landlord may have less control over the property, as the tenant is responsible for some of the operating expenses. Second, the responsibility for repairs. Depending on the type of net lease, the tenant may be responsible for repairs and maintenance, which could result in additional expenses for the tenant and potential conflicts between the landlord and tenant. Lastly, the difficulty in finding tenants. Not all tenants are willing to pay and take on the financial responsibility that comes with a net lease, which could make it more difficult for landlords to find tenants. So, in conclusion, a net lease is a popular type of lease agreement in commercial real estate that offers both benefits and drawbacks. Landlords should carefully consider their options and determine if a net lease is the best fit for their property and tenants. Thanks guys so much for watching another episode of Morning Walks with Mace. Make sure to hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the notification bell, and I hope to see you in the next one. Thanks for tuning in on what is a net lease. Bye for now.